1996. The French ceased nuclear testing, O.J. Simpson's civil trial began, the first clone sheep was created, and Osama bin Laden declared war on the United States. Without a doubt, it was a pretty significant year. Including for art and entertainment. The world of cinema had Trainspotting, the first Mission Impossible movie, Fargo, and my favorite Tchotchkes film, which is also my favorite movie of all time, Kids Return. In music, we got UGK's Ridin' Dirty, Soundtrack for the Blind by Swans, Modest Mouse's first full-length album, and 2 Fishman's albums. Oh, and sports, yes, can't forget sports. The MLB had its first broadcast on Fox, and the Baltimore Ravens were founded. That's cool. Go Ravens! Yeah! Anyways, let's move on to what you're all here for. Let's talk 1996 video games. It was a pretty loaded year. Super Mario 64, the first Diablo, Metal Slug, Daggerfall, Resident Evil, and so many more classic, foundational, or banging games released that year. Let me briefly share with you 2, almost 3, of those games. The 29th of January, 1996. Arguably the most well-known game developed on the build engine, Duke Nukem 3D, has been released. Although it has 3D in its title, the game isn't actually fully 3D, just like Doom. Duke 3D's build engine had some quirks and tricks to differentiate itself though. Unlike Doom, Duke 3D has movable geometry, voxels, and room-over-room level design through technological illusions. Destructible environments and fake room-over-room level design allowed Duke 3D to feel more real than Doom's almost abstract constructions of a far future Mars moon base. Doom certainly gave the impression of a sci-fi world clashing with primordial hell magic, but that's what it mostly amounted to: impressions. The environments of Doom and Doom 2 evoke the imagination of its players to do more of the heavy lifting. Just look at Doom 2's city level versus Duke Nukem 3D's city streets. They're worlds apart. Besides blowing up walls and skyscrapers, Duke 3D gave players the freedom to swing open doors, flush a toilet, and ride trams. Some little things to make the levels feel less like rooms for gunfights and more like actual places. So while Duke 3D wasn't a complete technological innovation, it pushed forward the idea of making game worlds feel more real through player interactions and actions. It was more of a design innovation than a software revolution. That technological revelation would come soon enough. Almost 5 months later, a game would be released to loudly and proudly mark 1996 as an important year for the medium and technology of video games. The 22nd of June, 1996, Quake is released. It's one of the most important video games ever made, but that goes without saying. At this time, Doom was an innovation, but Quake was the turn of a millennium. The hype for it was real. Maybe not as huge as Doom's, but that was an insane cultural explosion. With Quake, rather than being the zeitgeist of violence, id Software's 96 title helped pioneer game technology and culture. Doom had its plethora of community-made maps and mods, but Quake expanded beyond gameplay and into communal activities. The game helped popularize the speedrunning community, pioneered online deathmatch and esports, and helped to establish machinimas of all things. However, Quake's significant hype and legitimization of some gaming subcultures are not as historically remembered as its powerful and accessible 3D rendering. It's understandable, but simultaneously unfortunate because the game genuinely has great FPS design put into it. But I've already joined the tech circle jerk because holy shit, what an engine. In my Doom 3 review, I made the mistake of specifying Quake 2 introducing OpenGL when the first game literally had it, and partly because of it, Quake helped shape the future of gaming. While it can be just called fully 3D Doom, the comparison doesn't capture how different the two games play. Doom had its fair share of looming towers and deep pits, but because of its limited Z-axis manipulation, there was never any true full interaction with the world's height. With Quake, level designers could do proper room-over-room and more, creating a game that plays remarkably differently compared to its 1993 predecessor, even if it was at one point supposed to be the third Doom game during development. Quake left an incredible mark on the industry. It can't be understated how important the game's engine was. But across the pond, over in Europe, an ugly little duckling was late to the party. The 30th of September, 1997, Ukraine. Developed by Action Forms, Chasm the Rift is released in Europe and North America, and published by GT Interactive. Originally, it was planned to compete against Quake because GT Interactive had some beef with Activision after losing the publishing rights for Quake to them. Unfortunately for them, it would be too late for any competition between Chasm and Quake because Quake 2 released 3 months later, overshadowing the Ukrainian shooter with id's fame and Carmack's technological dark magic. Even though it received middling reviews when it first came out, the Eastern European shooter has received cult classic status beyond its release. While the game didn't and won't ever win any awards for pushing technology, game design, or shaping the games industry, it has a remarkable amount of charm. Chasm falls under the family of games that some call Eurojank, sometimes also referred to as Slavjank because of the descriptor's close association with Eastern European countries. Eurojank games aren't known for having high production values or polish, but really any janky game isn't. Because of this, many see them as bargain bin titles. This may make the categorization seem like an insult, but it's generally more used as a term of endearment. These games are made by developers who had limited resources when the games industry at the time largely had homes in only 3 places in the world. Eurojank games aren't necessarily the babies of the boonies, but considering the global competition, they had a lot stacked against them. Chasm is, by all means, clunky and not as impressive as Quake. I mean, the game isn't even fully 3D, even though it looks like it, but it technically isn't. If anything, Chasm is an amalgamation of id Software's classics, taking the flat levels of Wolfenstein 3D into an atmospheric world reminiscent of Quake, rendered similarly to Doom's 2.5D. Its only cool bit of tech is that it did body dismemberment before Quake 2 and Soldier of Fortune. Chasm is an oddly adorable delight with its environments and awkward English translation. Despite its glaring flaws, the game feels like genuine effort was exerted into it. It's a coarse, crude gem with sometimes frustrating and outdated design, but it also does some things well to stop it from being tossed into a landfill. So let's bring the industry to today. Close to 25 years later, it's 2024, and indie devs are now more prevalent than ever in video game releases, innovations, and enjoyment. Similar to the Eurojank games of yore, it's that same underdog story but on a global scale. People from anywhere sharing anything without a board of faceless suits breathing down their necks. Of course, profit is a goal in indie development. Why wouldn't it be? That's the nature of business. But I'm pointing out that the independent game developing scene is where experimentation and total artistic freedom flourish. Indies are known for their passion for making not just their dream games, but one with a developer's voice echoing throughout the experience. Designed by love rather than committee, something HROT proudly puts on display. The first thing you hear after loading into the title screen is gargling static overlaying masked breathing and a distant booming hum. This isn't the typical explosive guitar riffs, hyper-erratic breakbeats, or exciting synth music heard in most contemporary retro shooters. It's HROT's phenomenal mood setter. A pulsing bass permeates the air as you navigate sewers and alleys. The music oppresses you, making you feel like an interloper in your supposed homeland. And for good reason, your home is being invaded. An occupation shouldn't feel welcoming or like the norm. The suffocating atmosphere tells you the state of the country. It's collapsing around you as people hide in their homes, shops are abandoned, and facilities fall into disrepair. So when the soundtrack does swell up into a rising drop, the power fantasy kicks in as you root out the corruption. It's all very tense and evil, an incessant reminder that sick ghouls and danger lurk around the brick walls you pass by. As usual with indie retro shooters, HROT follows the lo-fi visuals synonymous with the genre. With low poly models and crunchy textures, we're almost back to the 90s. But HROT takes this a step further. The game's developer Spytihněv created a custom engine for HROT, giving them total control over everything. The Pascal-based engine is an almost funny choice today, considering the modern engine alternatives and programming languages developers can access. This isn't meant to be an insult, I'm admiring the game more than anything. Homebrewed game engines are a dying art, not just because they're a complex task, but also because of the greater push to standardize Unity and Unreal. At the end of the day, it's not about the tools, but how they're used. Really, if anything, Spytihněv's engine is another reason to appreciate HROT, since it further personalizes the developer's soul into the game, right into the very framework it's built on. The fact that HROT runs on a bespoke piece of software makes it much more personal. Spytihněv's proprietary software allows them to focus on the exact vision they wanted, and the final product in-game evokes the limitations of its inspirations. Quake had a limited color palette to save space on CDs to make room for its new 3D rendering tech. Browns, purples, and greens proliferate the castles and graveyards of id's classic. HROT follows suit, but more so as a stylistic homage than a necessity. Streets and rooms are full of dirty browns, accented with stained off-whites covered in pitch blacks and accompanied by mucus greens. The game is absurdly simplified into, for the most part, just 4 colors, and it makes good use of them without without ever feeling dull. It's a lovely minimalism found in contemporary retro games, but more so for those truly capturing the spirit of the past. The lighting is a bit more modern. Assumingly, it's all baked, but there are some lights that can be shot out to create black voids, and the subtle reflections definitely make it a bit more technologically impressive than Quake's engine. In general, the lighting is so much more utilized than in Quake. More often than not, you find yourself in pitch black halls that you can't peer through without a flashlight. These sections make ambushes so much more explosive. When the enemy gets a jump on you in the dark, it's like being whacked by a baseball bat from behind. I love the dedication to mimicking mid-90s 3D graphics. It's got slight vertex warping, clunky animations, and a restrained poly count. It's interesting how Spytihněv's engine is capable of greater detail than Quake's, yet more often than not, it restrains itself to match or even lessen the complexity of level geometry. It's dreadful and flat in the best way possible to imitate the era it's going for, but at the same time, it allows enough atmosphere to seep out of its textures and walls. Overall, it's what makes the level design so much more fascinating due to what it has to work around and what it's building off of. Simple is the best way to describe HROT. As a whole, its presentation embodies that so much that it's more candid than I'd like at times. I mean, when a game's shotgun, or just weapons in general, sound like this, it can't get any more straightforward. Regardless, its simplicity is done amazingly. With how saturated the FPS genre has become, it's harder to stand out from one another. Back in the 90s, any FPS game made after Doom was called a Doom clone. Nowadays, being a Doom clone is a badge of honor. If not Doom, retro FPS developers choose to be inspired by Quake, the big three build engine games, or the occasional obscurity. HROT, of course, looks at the classics, but draws many similarities to our own obscurity, our ugly duckling, Chasm the Rift. Levels in HROT are flat. They have minimal elevation, taking combat to rudimentary arenas of plains and blocks. Granted, enemies take advantage of the high ground, but most combat encounters will have the player enclosed into a large square to maneuver enemy projectiles. It's Chasm in spirit, but sometimes freed up by Quake's 3D space. Looking past the color palette and the fun jibbing, HROT uses verticality with intention, just like Quake. While not used as much as Quake since the game was showing off its tech, HROT has many occasions where height makes a difference in its gameplay. Whether it's an elevated firing squad or the apprehension felt when progressing through the underground, height is important, just as it was to the 96 classic. You get ambushed from above and fall into pit traps, making its environments much more spatial than Chasm. Chasm, in its restrictions, since it's not a fully 3D game, is much more akin to Wolfenstein 3D than anything, which also makes sense because both games are labyrinths. The flatness of the maps in HROT outweighs the verticality of the world. Upon further observation, just like Chasm, Wolfenstein 3D is a clear inspiration for its level design. I mean, there's this level that has blatant love for the Wolfenstein franchise, so it's not really a secret. But at the same time, Chasm is just as flat as the grandfather to FPS games. Not only are the levels not as geometrically complex as Quake's castles and sci-fi bases, well, most of the time, but they're far more maze-like. Wolfenstein 3D and many FPS games for the most part branched off from dungeon crawlers where exploring was arguably the biggest chunk of the gameplay. Navigating grimy labyrinths and stumbling upon bloodthirsty beasts was translated into a Nazi dungeon filled with warmongering racists, and then into a Mars base infested by demons. So on and so forth, the FPS has drastically changed from its dark, damp roots. HROT is very much leaning into that dungeon crawling ancestor of FPS games. You scrounge sewers, caves, catacombs, and basements for keys to progress. It follows that same gameplay loop many of us have become familiar with in these games. Explore the level, find a locked door, find a key, do steps 2 and 3 a few more times, and move on to the next level. There are switch-ups sometimes, but it's all routine. That isn't to downplay the design of the levels. It shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. What HROT is instead doing is reaching further back into game history and returning to the exploration of levels to be just as important as the shooting. That isn't to say you'll be lost in corridors in a densely sprawling maze like Spear of Destiny. It's actually pretty straightforward most of the time in HROT. Rather, it's the process of getting to each key with the electrical boxes, platforming, or even explosions that makes its exploration much more engaging. That's that build engine spirit showing. It's not necessarily the level layouts that make HROT enjoyable, but rather it's the inquisitive gameplay and atmosphere. A lot of the levels are claustrophobic close-quarter fights, causing the surface's open areas to feel incredibly relieving. Then that relief is turned to stress as hordes of enemies spawn throughout the area, making no place safe until you've jibbed everything. Each step to progress is tense since around any corner could be a grenade launcher waiting for you to peek. Everything is made to unease you in its level design, graphics, and sound. The anxious music, the sickening palette, the labyrinths of levels, all of it's done to keep the player on edge. This apocalyptic Eastern Bloc is filled with monstrosities hiding behind masks. Plagued infantry, a sweet homage to Quake's ogre, odd gremlins, cloaked larpers, a rabid horse wearing a gas mask, and a fucking gorilla? Wait, is that a sentient forklift? HROT is set on alienating the player, intersplicing absurdities between the horrors and the mundane. This balance keeps battles tense and ridiculous. Fights can pump adrenaline into your blood or fill your lungs with laughter, but usually both. The big dumb smile I got while fighting a gas mask wearing horse that is a genuine threat is something I'll never forget. Enemies, despite their silliness, are actually dangerous. Sometimes they're just straight up evil. The shotgunners can play dead. These wheelchair guys hit like a truck, and these wizards fucking teleport. The gas mask horse is constantly jumping around, being a hard target to hit. Imagine all that happening alongside 20 other enemies trying to kill you. While not on the level of Doom Eternal, you'll juggle weapons to effectively clear out arenas, shotgun to prioritize enemies, use the SMG to gun down a crowd from afar, dish out explosives to clear out groups, and use whatever else you still have ammo for. Although the combat isn't an intricate mindfuck, it certainly made me scramble at times. The underground tunnels and cramped buildings had me fighting for air, but the big fights were an onslaught. Enemies keep coming and coming, with each new one having me hope it would be the last. I would get exhausted but remain thrilled from the combat. With my limited supplies, I'd not just expend most of my ammo, but excessively drink wine and kick away enemies to stay afloat. It's overwhelming with a deeply relaxing end. Maintaining distance, ammo, and health are your top priorities if you're not secret hunting. The enclosed halls make it hard to avoid any damage from enemies and your own explosions, but more often than not, they have goodies for you to find that are absolutely necessary for playing on the hard difficulty. Clinging onto your last few shells and bullets before entering what could be the next big fight was a constant dread and pushed me to find every secret I could. Picking up stale bread in lockers, lost ammo boxes in forgotten rooms, and meat salad whenever I could find it, I was truly scrounging for survival. Secret hunting isn't convoluted either. Thankfully, it doesn't follow Wolfenstein or Rise of the Triad in that regard, especially for level progression, but HROT still somewhat maintains the significance of secret hunting to the core of the gameplay. I wouldn't necessarily call them obligatory, but they're without a doubt life-saving. One minute you're fighting for your life in a damp dungeon, and the next you're on a lunch break dining on canned meat, milk, and vintage Czechoslovakian wine. If anything, HROT has a fascination with food. At the end of each episode, the game gifts the player a different recipe. Episode 1 gives a recipe for beef stroganoff, Episode 2 gives a recipe for cauliflower brain, and Episode 3 gives a recipe for eggs and aspic. And honestly, it's a proper reward for all the violence. After being drenched in sewage, trudging through Viscera, and having your life flash before your eyes, a nice warm meal hits the spot.
The lighting sucks. Although I failed to get any Bushek Zigarhartik, this beef stroganoff is pretty damn good. I mean, yeah, it's pretty good. Among the jibbing and terrifying enemies, the thing that HROT really wants you to interact with is Czechoslovakian culture. While HROT is a concoction of known and unknown games, Spytihněv makes it stand out through its intricate curios.
It's a game where inquisitiveness is as important as its shooting. You can spin a top, play an old Soviet handheld, and play with a train set. In the middle of all the fighting, there's a toy box of trinkets to mess around with that exists separately from what's typically the center of an FPS game. They're hidden respites, or really more like distractions, that make the dreadful invasion feel so much more silly. Imagine clearing streets of ruthless enemies to then stumble upon a train set. I sat here for about 10 fucking minutes. For being sideshows, they're overly detailed. I don't mean that in a bad way, I actually love the commitment to the bit. One doesn't expect there to be so many intricate gags. It's a barrage of dumb jokes that just work because of how it contrasts with the atmosphere, turning a terrible event into a sick joke that lands. The newts that appear at the end of the game are when the absurdity of the world fully reveals itself. The newts themselves are a reference to a Czech novel titled War of the Newts, which not only sounds like a funny read, but proves how much the game is dedicated to intertwining Spytihněv's nationality. Earlier, I said that HROT wants to showcase Czechoslovakian history and culture, which is true. However, I think it'd also be true to say that it's more invested in the Czech side of things. This is pretty much Spytihněv's design philosophy that you can see throughout all of their games. Tragedy of Prince Rupert is a love letter to Karel Zeman's film Invention for Destruction. It's an astonishing Czech sci-fi film mostly based on Jules Verne's For the Flag. And honestly, it's probably not the only film Prince Rupert is paying tribute to. Zeman's work is characteristically surreal and stunning. From crazy live-action movies to animated dreams, his films stir up the same wonder of a Georges Méliès film with over-the-top costumes and magical visual effects. Prince Rupert evokes the set design, fantasy, and early film aesthetics that it dearly loves. As much as I'd love to keep rambling about Invention for Destruction and just movies in general, I think we should just move on to Spytihněv's most recent work. HROT is a spiritual successor to the Czech RTS game Paranoia 2 by Phoenix Arts. Coincidentally also released in 1996, it's a clone of the original Dune 2 RTS game for DOS, but instead of clans fighting for mind-altering drugs, they're fighting for space beer hops. Paranoia 2 is neat. It's nothing super outstanding to me since I'm not an RTS aficionado despite having helped make one recently, but it's supposedly one of, if not the first games to support a 1024 by 768 resolution with 256 colors. If I'm wrong about that, hey, I'm wrong about that. Don't look at me. I'm going off of the minimal amount of info there is about this game. Though the most important thing to me really is the soundtrack, because holy shit does it bang. HROT essentially is just a modern reboot of this game with space hops, cinematics, and all. It's rather simple compared to something like Age of Empires 2, but the gameplay is complex enough to be engaging when paired with the silliness of its premise. Like Tragedy of Prince Rupert, HROT is a carefully made homage to a Czech artifact that only Spytihněv could have made since they have a great passion for the culture that makes up its foundation. Lastly, there's Spytihněv's earliest game, or at least earliest on Steam or publicly available. It's called Yeij, or Legion in English, and it's similar to HROT. It's an homage to medieval Czechoslovakia. It's a compelling adventure game where you make your own story in a bleak world. The craziest thing to me is that this came out in 2007 and would perfectly fit in with the sea of indie games that spawned from the PSX resurgence in the past 5 or so years. It's low poly, has a bare bones lighting system, and is filled with vertex warping galore on its characters. Genuinely, if this game piques your interest, then please play it. Even though you'll more than likely need to refer to a guide for its puzzles, the blend of dungeon crawling combat and point and click adventure interactions make for a tantalizing game. However, curiously enough, this is the game with the least amount of Czech pride from the developer. The puzzle gameplay, story, and especially atmosphere take center stage, with the only tie-in to Spytihněv's roots being the setting. The game takes place in the real town of Yeij, and the land has been engulfed by water, plague, and all-around misfortune. Beer is low and the town is no longer prospering since the mines have shut down. Yeij was actually known for its mining operations, so Spytihněv has always been keen on maintaining authenticity to Czech inspirations. Yet, the game is disconnected from its real-life analog. It feels secluded from the real world, tied into its small game world and wrapped in its dark fantasy narrative, which could explain why it feels less culturally representative of the developer. Well, if you can count drinking beer as Czech pride, then I'm probably wrong. There's a lot of beer in this game, and I know Prague is full of it. And finally, we wrap back to HROT. Beating the game allows players to play around with an astronomical clock simulator called the Orloj, a very real clock tower built in Prague. Like Yeij, most of HROT's levels have you killing enemies in real places. The Palace of Culture, the multiple castles, this church, the mausoleum, and more are all based on real-world locations. The very first level's metro is based on Kosmonautu Station, but unlike Yeij, it's a disconnect that feels deeply grounded. Streets have old Soviet cars, these steam vents based on real ones found in Prague, and references to the Soviet cosmonauts, among other things. Aside from being period-appropriate set dressing, there are various posters and map props linked to historical events in the Czechoslovak Republic in which HROT takes place. There are callbacks to old movements and parties, contemporary political slogans, and promotions for International Women's Day, which was made an official holiday by Alexandra Kollontai and Vladimir Lenin. Lenin is a recurring spirit in HROT. There's a poem of him, an enemy is a bust of his head, and there's definitely more than one mural of him. The Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia is the obvious connection to make here. Although it was under Brezhnev's regime, Lenin was the first to lead the Soviet Union, making him the face of Russian communism. There's an odd relationship with Lenin and HROT. He's terrifying, but the people in this world look up to him for guidance. Lenin's most memorable appearance is this poignant yet ominous video of him giving a speech. I don't know how else to describe how I felt when seeing it, but as if I'm looking at a tragic figure. I still somewhat feel that way even after learning this was referencing a project from the Czech demo scene. I won't pretend to be an expert on Soviet politics and history, but the impression I get from the decaying world of HROT is that the Soviet Union's omniscience led countries like once Czechoslovakia to be shackled by unwanted authority, a vision of a once prosperous future muddled by authoritarian obsession, which makes the final boss thematically appropriate despite how fucking out of left field it feels. Up until this point in the video, I've done my best to not spoil the endgame of HROT, but I can't anymore. The final boss is just too insane to not share. It's a multi-stage fight set in a stadium, a callback to the final level of Duke Nukem 3D. First you fight an evil-ass robot, which in itself is a joke that nods to the ED-209s from RoboCop. Then the real fight begins as you fight that fucking old-ass meme of Vladimir Putin on a bear, but it redeems itself in being a fun boss, with the final phase being Putin on a pterodactyl. It's obscenely absurd, the peak of the mountain of HROT's silliness. Everything you've done has led to a rambunctious boss fight to then dive into his mouth and eviscerate his pervasive beating heart. But what's this all for? What was HROT's story? When initially playing, there's little to none. All you need to know is what the sign tells you. You move through levels with the only knowledge of having to make it to the end, killing whatever is trying to stop you. Boomer shooters aren't usually known for their stories. FPS games from the 90s, and even many today, aren't heralded for their writing, although there are a few exceptions. Doom, Quake, Duke Nukem, and more are remembered for their gameplay rather than their story and writing. These games' stories don't expand much beyond a premise, which is to say that it was fine for the most part since they're all pretty silly and intended to give an action-packed experience above all else. Similarly to the boomer shooters of the past, HROT instead revels in its atmosphere to do its heavy lifting. Since its gameplay is a blend of Quake meets Wolfenstein 3D, heavier on the Wolfenstein part, it's not on the level of explosiveness as quite a number of 90s FPS games. The atmosphere, intertwined with maze exploration and the myriad of interactables, fulfills the need for engagement and story. The only story to find is unraveling the history of the levels you move through. It's more of a cultural tour through explorative gameplay rather than wanting to tell a narrative. If I were to try to reach out and grab a theme from its minimalist story, it would be that Putin's occupation of the motherland drained the life out of everything, replacing it with bile and rust. Defeating him roots out the corruption and restores happiness. I mean, his corpse literally gives you a piece of the Orloi to fix it, a symbol of Czech pride and culture. His death relating to the Orloi is the most damning piece of storytelling in the game. The occupation of your homeland is the biggest blow to one's national identity, but that can't take away what makes your country since every bit of culture is inlaid into every brick and piece of concrete in the land. Czechoslovakia wished to proceed on its own terms and will, but the Soviet Union didn't like to see one of its satellite states leaving its conglomeration, leading to the Prague Spring. HROT's story is not a complete repulsion of socialist ideals and philosophy. It's a resistance and ridicule of authoritarian rule. Through sheer cultural revelry and willpower, the player overcomes the warmongering outsiders and allows Prague to return to its self-autonomous state. Spytihněv once stated in an interview that maybe the player character was actually the invader and the enemies were defending their homeland. But I'm sorry, that just can't be the case. Why would a foreigner fight through hell to fix the clock tower of a city they have no personal connection to? Why would they start in an underground bunker with the only instructions of defending the motherland? Why would the player character be reinvigorated by Czech food if they weren't Czech? The world of HROT is not depicted as hellish because of socialism. It's depicted as a dilapidated version of itself now that it's being invaded. It's a corrupted version of Czechoslovakia from outside influence. Even if it was more of a decry of socialism than it was of the Soviet Union, that's not entirely what the story for HROT was. That's just an interpretation I came up with. Once the blood settles and the credits roll, the story, above all else, was a method to impart curated aspects of Czech culture straight into my brain. HROT made me look up obscure Czech games, read a bit on Czechoslovakian history, appreciate a Czech filmmaker's works, and even cook Czech beef stroganoff. What other game has made me fucking cook anything? The story is vague and practically non-existent, basically resulting in headcanons as to what happened or what all the levels meant. For better or worse, I wouldn't have asked for it any other way, as it only made partaking in Czech culture so much more engrossing and at the core of the experience. So, at the end of the day, what is HROT? It's peak, or apex, or point, at least that's what Google Translate says, but HROT as a game is beautifully simple. It's nothing over the top or overly complicated. It knows exactly what it wanted to do, and it perfectly executed on that. I can't say much else than I've already said. However, it's not the nigh-perfect implementation of its simplicity that makes HROT special. While I did put a heavy emphasis on its restrictions and exploration, the combat is still thrilling and hectic. It's not mechanically intricate, but it's still an emotional roller coaster with adrenal highs and lows. Gibs and daunting halls make up for most of the initial impression one has when playing through this game. After all, it's what most FPS players, especially retro FPS fans, get a game like HROT for, which is why its cultural pride makes it much more special than a lot of its peers. Cutting through its lo-fi violence and brooding mood is a wonderful playfulness in its minutia of trinkets. No other game has really made me look deep into a developer's culture, interests, and whatnot. Playing HROT is like being handed a picture book of Czech history and personal love from Spytihněv. Indie games are the creations of artists, products of passion that mirror their creators' livelihoods in every way imaginable. From feelings to hobbies, politics to personal struggles, niche interests to their home country, indie games are a reflection of the hands that made them. Spytihněv's entire ludography is an extension of themselves. In HROT's case, its meticulous interactions with all sorts of objects and map assets create such a personal experience. The intimacy felt exploring decrepit streets to play with toys and learn about their country's history is incredibly sentimental. The motherland is withering and ravaged, but the people and their creations are what make such a terrible event so much more palatable. Spytihněv is a talented developer in both design and programming, but their explicit love for who they are and where they're from is what makes HROT worth a playthrough. If the combat or labyrinths couldn't convince you, maybe its affectionately built world will. Considerably underrated in the boom shoot pantheon. I mean, Proteus is cool, but it ain't no HROT.